just boiling with smoke.
He
was just screaming, "My wife's in the house, my wife is in the house."
Then firefighters made a grim discovery.
She had a gunshot wound in the heart area.
Norma Ates had been murdered. The crime scene ransacked.
She had actually been running for her life, and there was bullet holes in the wall. She'd been shot 7 times.
A stranger's knock was the key to cracking the case.
He walked up to the Ates house and banged on the door.
But it would take years for police to learn what happened next. It was June 2nd, 1991, in the small town of Baker, Florida. High school teacher Jimmy Ates was getting ready to watch another class of students graduate when a colleague gave him some disturbing news.
He whispered in my ear and he said, "So, Mr. Ates, I've been told that your house is on fire." I started running down the senior hallway and went to my car.
Minutes later, Jimmy arrived at his home.
All I saw was smoke. It was just boiling with smoke. Smoke was coming out the front of the house and the side of the house.
Jimmy's wife, Norma, had been too sick to attend the graduation celebration. Now he feared she was trapped inside the burning house.
I started running around the house, and Ralph Ellis, the fireman that was inside of the house at that time, said he heard me in a panicked voice hollering for my wife, and I was trying to go. Once I got around to the back and saw that I didn't see her, I was trying to go in, and they got a hold of me.
He was pretty hysterical, saying that his wife was still in the house. He was just screaming, "My wife's in the house, my wife is in the house."
Onlookers who had gathered at the scene had to keep Jimmy from going inside.
There was 1 or 2 of them that pulled me to the front yard. They had to force me to the front yard.
Jimmy says he was panic-stricken over the fate of his wife trapped in the fire.
My house was on fire and I couldn't find my wife.
Jimmy became overwhelmed. He started to hyperventilate and fainted at the scene.
I don't remember passing out.
Jimmy was taken to the hospital. Norma Ates' mother also got word of the fire and immediately rushed to the house. She also begged firefighters to let her enter the house and search for her daughter.
They wasn't letting nobody go in the house. It was horrible.
As smoke billowed from the Ates' home, firefighters tried to find Norma before it was too late.
We started a room-by-room search. The smoke and heat was extremely difficult. I could see probably no more than 6 inches in front of my face. At that point, I got to the Ates bedroom and got just inside the door, and something was obstructing my path, which was a mattress pulled off the bed. I took the mattress and just pushed it back up on the bed and discovered Miss Ates' body laying on the floor.
Captain Ralph Ellis knew right away that Norma was dead.
I immediately went to her head. We rotated her body over on her back. She was face down, and she had a wound in the heart area, and as soon as her back met the floor, blood and other liquids came out of that wound there. And I checked her vital signs, and she had no vital signs then, so we exited at that point.
But he didn't think it was the smoke nor the fire that had killed her.
She had a gunshot wound in the heart area.
He believed Norma had been murdered. When investigator Mike Stewart from the Okaloosa Sheriff's Department arrived, the crime scene was in chaos.
Smoke was coming out of the house. We had firefighters everywhere, and they had told me that there was a female inside that had been shot, that she was dead.
When firefighters were finally able to put out the blaze, they noticed something very unusual. The living room was charred, but the fire had never reached the master bedroom. One thing was clear: the Eights had been robbed.
It had been pretty well gone over. All the jewelry that she was wearing is missing. Her billfold was gone. There was checks that was missing. All the credit cards was gone. They took the 38. They took the 22.
Had Norma been killed as the result of a botched robbery? When the autopsy report came back, it confirmed the cause of Norma's death.
The medical examiner determined that the cause of death was gunshot wounds. There are multiple gunshot wounds. She basically bled out internally. No one wound was fatal. No one wound hit a major artery or a vital organ. The wounds to the chest, basically her lungs filled up with blood.
Investigators speculated the Eights residence could have been targeted. Jimmy ran a farm stand on his property. The side business generated a lot of money that weekend, and it was inside the house. Anyone who knew the couple would have expected Norma and Jimmy to be out at the graduation celebration. The theory was strengthened when they noticed the back door was unlocked.
The sliding glass door was cracked open.
Perhaps someone was looking for quick cash and was surprised that Norma was home. But as he looked closer, investigator Mike Stewart felt something about the scene wasn't adding up.
The scene looked different to me. I'd worked burglaries most of my career. In some rooms, it was very neat. It looked like it was neat and organized. The drawers were pulled out perfectly even, where no burglar's going to do that. And then in other rooms, it would be complete opposite. They'd just be dumped in the floor.
The fire itself was also suspicious. Experts ruled that it had been set intentionally. But police couldn't figure out why the fire had been started on the opposite side of the house from where Norma's body was found.
You would think that if they're going to start a fire, they're going to start it in the bedroom where she's at to destroy evidence, not in a picture room in front of the main road where everybody's going to see it as they drive by.
Through the evidence, investigators began to piece together what happened to Norma during the final moments of her life.
You could see what had happened in the house. She had actually been running for her life. And there was bullet holes in the wall. There were some in the bathroom. And like she'd been chased in the house and shot. She'd been shot 7 times.
There was a splinter in the door frame where it looked like the bedroom door had been forced open. So to us, it appeared that Norma was running down the hallway, running from her attacker, and tried to shut the bedroom door, and the door had been forced open, causing some damage to the door frame.
It was a savage scene. It appeared Norma was getting dressed when the attack began.
She didn't have her silk blouse on when she was discovered, but she was fully dressed. High heels, nylons, skirt, slip.
As investigators continued to process the master bedroom, they made another important discovery.
The phone was laying right beside her.
Investigators discovered Norma had left them a critical clue. She died while making a desperate call for help.
It appeared that Norma's dying act was to try to dial 911.
Investigators listened to the recorded 911 call made from Norma's house to the Okaloosa County dispatcher.
911, do you need police fire ambulance? Hello? Hello?
At 6:25, when it came in, all the 911 operator heard was static on the line.
The operator never heard Norma's voice. The coroner's office believed that was because Norma was unable to speak.
The medical people had told us that she wouldn't have been able to talk at the time because of her wounds.
By placing that 911 call at 6:25, Norma had time-stamped the attack. The medical examiner concluded that Norma died shortly after making that phone call, but before the fire was set.
There was no smoke in her lungs.
While investigators were creating a timeline of Norma's final moments, her husband Jimmy was recovering at the hospital. It was his doctor who told him the terrible news. His high school sweetheart and wife of 27 years had been shot to death.
He says, Jim, she didn't make it. I cried that night all night. I didn't understand it.
He was very upset. He just could not believe that Norma had gotten killed. Jimmy took it very hard. He was just in pure shock.
When Norma's mother learned her only child was gone, she was also shattered.
It was just too horrible to think that somebody had shot her. It just didn't make no sense. It was just horrible. Never dreamed of nothing like that ever happening to her.
Norma had been the light of her mother's life.
To me, she was just perfect. We were real close all of her life. She would come to the house most every day to eat her lunch.
After 2 days in the hospital, Jimmy was released, distraught, and still shaken by the death of his wife. Now investigators wanted to ask Jimmy some questions.
We knew he was the last person to see her alive. And it's like any other murder case, you want to eliminate the last person that was with her.
Jimmy immediately felt the pressure and was upset that he was under scrutiny.
I was shaken because they actually thought that was questioning me as though I was the one that had committed the crime. And I said, how in the world? And I broke down, I was crying. And I said, how can I go and bury my wife and face her family and my family, and you folks saying that you think that I was the one that done that?
Detectives were curious why Norma hadn't joined Jimmy at the graduation ceremony.
She was planning on going with me. All of a sudden, she just started throwing up. And she said, Jim, I just don't think I need to go. Says, I've already thrown up a couple of times. We had a parting there in the kitchen. Are you okay? You need me to call you mom? No, I've already talked to Mama. Mama knows about it.
Investigators had some problems with Jimmy's account. When Norma's body was discovered, it looked like she was getting dressed to leave the house. She was even wearing her high heels. Perhaps after Jimmy left, Norma felt better and started getting ready to join him at the graduation. When police tried to establish a timeline of events that night, Jimmy said that the intruder must have attacked his wife just after he left the house.
I didn't look at no clock.
Whatever time he left the house, Jimmy was certain he was at the school by 6:30.
I was a senior sponsor. We were supposed to be there at 6:30.
Jimmy said once he got to the school, he mingled with numerous teachers, as well as the assistant vice principal. They all confirmed he was at the school. Then there was the issue of the murder weapon. The medical examiner determined that Norma had been shot with a .22 caliber pistol. The same type of gun was missing from the Yates residence. Police never tested Jimmy's hands for gunshot residue. But he voluntarily told them a test might come back positive.
We'd asked him if we tested his hands, if he'd have gunshot residue. And he said, maybe. I'd been at the hog pen on the day of the homicide, shooting at a hawk with a .22 pistol.
Meanwhile, investigators scoured the neighborhood looking for the gun that killed Norma. Had the killer gotten rid of it fleeing the crime scene?
We searched all around the residence. We searched this wooded area here. We searched behind the house. We checked side roads, dirt roads, any place where we think that they could be the weapon put. I mean, we looked for it. This is a very rural area that we're at right now, so finding that weapon It's like finding a needle in a haystack.
The gun was nowhere to be found. Investigators decided to dig deeper into Jimmy's story. They interviewed Norma's mother, who spoke with her daughter just an hour before she was murdered.
I called her, it was around 5:30. We talked on a little bit, and she says, you know what, I spit up most of my lunch.
That backed up Jimmy's story about Norma's being sick. But what she said next really caught investigators' attention. She said Norma was frightened by a stranger who had knocked on their front door just minutes before. It was the first big break in the case. Investigators started canvassing the area, looking for leads on the mysterious stranger, and it didn't take long to get one.
We'd found out that a vehicle was broke down below the house here, and that was one of the points of interest to us. We were trying to locate the people that had actually broke down and see what had happened.
They described the man was out with the hood up on the truck, and it was during the time period that people were going to the baccalaureate service. So we knew they had to be there between 6 and 7 o'clock. No one knew who these people were.
Was the door knock an attempt to see if the Eights had left for the high school graduation? Was the broken down car a cover to case the house before robbing it? The burglary gone wrong theory began to look promising.
We wanted to locate these people and see if they were involved in the murder, if they were just acting like they were broke down.
But first, they had to be found. An all-points bulletin was issued, and the search was made public. Investigators needed a break.
The sheriff's department ran advertisements in the newspaper. They went on local TV trying to determine who these people were, see if they would come forward. No one ever came forward, so that makes you wonder, were they involved?
It seemed as if the two strangers had disappeared into thin air. While investigators continued to try to track them down, they also began to develop a new suspect, Jimmy Eights' 25-year-old nephew, Robert Money. Robert had been at the house on the day of the murder, working for Jimmy at the fruit stand.
The only time he was ever asked to work at the fruit and vegetable stand was the Sunday that Mrs. Eights got killed.
Since Robert knew Jimmy and Norma were planning on attending the graduation ceremony that night, police speculated he might have seen the empty house as an opportunity for a robbery.
He certainly knew that Jimmy had taken in a good chunk of money into the fruit stand that weekend, and that money would have been kept in the house. Robert had a felony background. He had a number of felony convictions.
Robert Money and another individual that ran together had been arrested for a hate crime, had been arrested for burning a cross in a man's yard. And Robert was notorious for getting in trouble at that time in his life. He was a young man who drank too much and worked very little. And he'd just gotten out of prison. He really had no employment.
Robert's criminal past raised serious red flags. When police brought him in for questioning, he appeared nervous and acted like he was hiding something. Detectives were suspicious and asked him to take a lie detector test.
He failed the polygraph test.
Robert Money was becoming a promising suspect. Investigators started to hammer away at his story. Under pressure, Robert made a stunning revelation.
Robert confessed that he'd buried a .22 pistol out by Holt Cemetery. It was a .22, which was consistent with what Mrs. Eights got killed with.
Police demanded he show them where the .22 caliber pistol was buried.
He takes us to this location, and we dig up a gun. It was a .22 Armistice. We sent that into the crime lab.
Could police have just found the murder weapon? While ballistics experts tested the gun, detectives pressed Robert for answers.
We got to question Robert a lot about why he buried this gun, why was he so nervous about this gun. And he said because he was a convicted felon, he knew he was not supposed to have a gun,
Robert said he didn't want to end up back in prison on a gun possession charge. Police were still suspicious. They asked him what he did after working with Jimmy at the fruit stand on the day of the murder. Robert said Jimmy had given him a ride home because he didn't have a car.
I took him home. I dropped him off. I was fixing to leave. He come up and he says, Uncle Jim, I left my keys in the hothouse. I can't get in my house.
Robert said he and Jimmy drove back to the house to get his keys, and he was dropped off for the second time around 5:45. He said his mother had called him not long after he had gotten home.
15 to 20 minutes later, we have his mother calling him. We got him 11 miles away in his home about the time of Mrs. Aids' attack. He had no means of transportation.
It seemed Robert could not have been at the Aids residence at the time of the murder. But what about the .22 caliber pistol he had hidden at the cemetery? The crime lab returned the results of the ballistics test.
It was determined that that gun was not the gun used to kill Mrs. Aids.
The buried gun was not the murder weapon. Police asked him to take another lie detector test, and this time he passed.
He did very well in the second polygraph.
Robert Money was officially ruled out as a suspect. The investigation was now back to square one. In the weeks following Norma's murder, Jimmy tried to pick up the pieces of his life. His wife was gone, his home destroyed by fire. He found solace with Norma's parents.
After the murder, Mr. and Mrs. Catawba took him in, and he stayed and lived with them.
6 months after Norma's death, Jimmy started dating. But his choice in women raised some eyebrows. 18-year-old Glenda Nash was a former student at the high school where he taught. In the small town of Baker, the 26-year age difference between Jimmy and Glenda was scandalous.
The most of it came from people that had never laid eyes on me. And I was like, I don't even know who that is. And so that would just make me mad. It just small town gossip is what it was.
In December 1993, 2.5 years after Norma's murder, Jimmy and Glenda were married. Norma's mother had no problem with Jimmy starting over with a younger woman. In fact, the couple became an important part of her life.
They'd come every week. Sometimes it was often that they come.
We had us a little girl, and we were just a family. We went and saw her mother, every weekend, every Sunday we were there.
Meanwhile, Norma's murder remained unsolved. In fact, the case had gone cold. But Norma's family never gave up. Four years later, they were able to get Florida Governor Lawton Chiles to reopen the case.
Florida Department of Law Enforcement was asked to review the case and reopen the case in 1995. And I started going over the evidence and looking at the crime scene.
After a thorough analysis, investigators developed a new game plan. One of the leads the original detectives had never been able to follow up on was the mysterious stranger seen outside the Aids house just before the fire. It looked like their best shot. They offered a $10,000 reward for new information.
We made a news release that the Florida Department of Law Enforcement was doing a fresh look at this cold case. We also started putting flyers up in all the convenience stores, a picture of Mrs. Aids. And we ran an article in the Fort Walton Beach paper announcing the Florida Department of Law Enforcement was reopening this case. And we put those flyers from Pensacola to Defuniak Springs. And it did what I hoped it'd do. It started generating people talking about the Aids case.
4 years after Norma Aids' murder, the investigation was heating up again. The mysterious strangers who neighbors had seen outside the house on the night of the crime had finally been found.
They never realized that the law enforcement was looking for them.
Ron and Judy Nicholson told investigators that on the night of Norma's murder, their truck had broken down. and Ron had been the mysterious stranger who had knocked on the door. But he had an innocent explanation. He was hoping to use the phone to call for help.
He walked up to the Yates house and banged on the door. And he couldn't get an answer from the Yates home.
He then walked up to the nugget store, which is approximately a 10-minute walk. He used the phone.
Nicholson told police he made and received several phone calls at the Golden Nugget gas station to arrange getting his truck towed.
We know from the phone records that the last phone call Mr. Nicholson receives from his daughter about sending someone to help him with a broken-down truck occurs at 5:56 p.m. He spends about 5 minutes in the store getting a drink, and then he begins the 10-minute walk back to where his vehicle is.
They never noticed a fire at the house. They never noticed anything out of the ordinary.
It seemed like another dead end. Then Ron told police that on the walk back from the gas station, he had bumped into the owner of the house and they had had a strange conversation.
Mr. Yates explains that his wife was very ill and he was sorry he couldn't help him, but he had to get back to the high school. Mr. Nicholson always thought that was an odd conversation, why a man runs all the way out to the highway to explain why he didn't help him.
Investigators realized that if Ron was right, Jimmy Yates was still in his home at the time of the shooting. Police believe Norma had been shot sometime between 6 and 6:25 p.m.
The time Mrs. Yates dialed 911, she'd already been shot multiple times and ran through that house. The scene, and she'd already laid for a period of time and bled on one side of the bed before she got to the phone to dial 911. So it still puts Mr. Yates at the house. I mean, he can't get out of that house before 6:25.
The new timeline now gave Jimmy Yates plenty of time to murder his wife. But investigators needed more if they were going to prove that Jimmy Yates had shot Norma before setting fire to the house. They called in the FBI. Agent Kevin Kelm analyzed the evidence at the house. He didn't think that it looked like a burglary at all.
The drawers haven't been gone through, it's just pulled out and tipped over. You just don't see burglaries happen like this.
While there were several items missing, what was left behind had always made investigators suspicious.
There's a lot of very valuable stuff left laying around that you would think that it would clearly that they would have picked up. There was a small TV set in the bedroom, things that could be easily sold. There was jewelry in the bedroom. There was guns in the closet that were not taken. It appeared that Norma had actually had fallen on one side of the bed. On the opposite side of the bed where she was found, it appeared that she laid it in this spot for a period of time because we have a large pool of blood there. So she obviously laid there, then made it to the phone, pulling the phone across the bed, and we believe dialed 911. The person that staged this then pulls all the dresser drawers out. They're sitting on top of the spot where she bled out. And the drawers were just pulled out, set down, pulled out, set down. There's a lot of very valuable stuff left laying around that you would think that it would clearly that they would have picked up.
After a careful review, Agent Kelm decided there were just too many inconsistencies.
My conclusion is that this was a staged scene. This was not a burglary. It was one that was made to look like a burglary.
And he felt there was only one person who would have staged it.
The reason you stage is so that you can misdirect the investigation away from the most logical suspect. And who is the most logical suspect? Jimmy Yates.
More than 4 years after his wife's murder, Jimmy Yates had become the lead suspect.
There was 2 guns taken. There was jewelry taken. All of her rings was taken. Her purse was taken. Credit cards was taken. All of the things that was taken, where are they?
Jimmy said there was a logical reason that some valuables were left behind. The thief never found them.
She had put her jewelry in a shoebox in that closet where she had all of her shoes. I didn't even know it myself.
But investigators didn't buy his story. As they dug deeper, they discovered a possible motive for the crime. Rumors swirled that Jimmy and Glenda were having an affair before Norma's murder.
There was speculation he was seeing a girl at the high school, a young girl, and that he married later on.
I never had any thoughts nor imaginations nor even dreams that I was ever going to get together with her. I would have never went out with her if I'd ever thought that anybody would say such a thing.
Jimmy denies he had any kind of relationship with Glenda before his wife's murder.
Not only deny, I swear that there was never even a thought that that would ever occur.
Despite the denial, investigators believed they were building a solid case against Jimmy Yates. When they informed Norma's mother that Jimmy was their prime suspect, she was shocked.
I didn't think about that he could have, done anything. I didn't see how he could have done such.
The investigators told her about the mounting evidence against him. The Nicholsons placing Jimmy in the house at the time of the 911 call, the staged burglary, and the possibility of an affair. It was enough to convince her that Jimmy might be guilty. Norma's mother then revealed a conversation she had had with her daughter before the murder. Up until now, she had kept it to herself to protect Jimmy's feelings.
She said, "Mother says it looks like I can't live with Jimmy." She says, "I'm not walking on eggshells anymore."
Norma's mother said just 3 weeks before her murder, Norma had told her she was unhappy and was thinking of leaving Jimmy.
I don't believe that. I'm telling you before God, I do not believe that conversation took place. I believe that Louise is not telling the truth.
The evidence against Jimmy Yates was stacking up, but did prosecutors have enough to make a case against him? From the beginning, fire marshals on the scene had questioned why the blaze had been started in the front room of the house, far away from the murder.
This is the area of origin. This is where the fire started.
In the charred debris where the fire was set, investigators had discovered an intriguing clue.
The fire marshal recovered what was determined to be candle wax and some burned newspaper that was embedded in the candle wax.
He believed that whoever started the fire used a candle surrounded by newspaper to delay the start of the blaze.
The only reason you set a fire with a delay device is so that the fire will occur and be discovered while the person who set that fire is someplace else.
Kelm said the killer wanted the blaze to be discovered, but only after he had time to leave and establish an alibi.
The problem with that is that it's not really an alibi. An alibi is when you and I are together and we are someplace else when the crime occurs and you swear, "I saw that person, you saw me, and he didn't do it." In this particular case, what's occurred is that you have an alibi by proxy. Okay, I'm with a whole group of people when this crime was discovered, but none of those people were there when I was actually committing the crime because I have a time delay device to give me that interval of safety.
And investigators believed that person was Jimmy Yates. 6 years after Norma's death, he was indicted for first-degree murder. Spectators crammed the courtroom as the trial got underway. Prosecutors were confident with their case.
It was the classic circumstantial evidence case. When you linked all the circumstances together, every circumstance pointed to but one answer, and that was that Jimmy Yates killed his wife.
Prosecutors challenged Yates' story that Norma decided to stay home from the graduation because she was sick.
She's found fully dressed in everything, her high heels. The only piece of clothing she has not yet put on is her blouse.
A person who's at home sick is not dressed that way.
Prosecutors then presented the most powerful evidence against Jimmy, the timeline. Investigators took the stand and testified how they meticulously checked the timing of Ron Nicholson's walk from the Golden Nugget gas station to Jimmy Yates' house.
We walked and we timed it. We know the length of time it takes to walk down to the Golden Nugget from the driveway at Jimmy Yates' house.
And it takes you about 10, 12 minutes.
Phone records showed Ron Nicholson finished his calls for a tow truck at 5:57. He said he drank a soda and left the gas station about 5 minutes later. After making the 10 to 12 minute walk back, he had a conversation with Jimmy Yates around 6:15. Jimmy then went back into the house. Judy Nicholson said she saw a car leave the Yates driveway sometime later. Norma had called 911 at 6:25. Prosecutors told the jury that the Nicholsons' testimony proved Jimmy was in the house after Norma had been shot.
The time Mrs. Yates dialed 911, she'd already been shot multiple times and ran through that house. It was Norma's dying act. It was almost like Norma saying, Jimmy, you're not going to get away with this. Everybody's going to know what you did to me.
Prosecutors called Jimmy's wife, Glenda, to the stand. They hoped the jury would see an affair between Jimmy and his former student as a motive for the murder.
No one could get on the stand and say it because no one, there wasn't anyone that could say it.
Glenda stood firmly behind the man she married.
I know in my heart he didn't do it.
When prosecutors rested, they were confident they had presented a solid case.
I've prosecuted worse criminals than Jimmy Yates, but I don't know that I've ever prosecuted a guy who I think committed a more calculated murder. This thing had to be planned out. This whole evening was a setup. It wasn't spontaneous. He wasn't in a panic because he took the time to turn right and go out to get rid of that gun.
The defense began by countering the state's timeline. Witness after witness took the stand, who said they definitely saw Jimmy at the school by 6:30, 5 minutes after Norma called 911.
They saw Jimmy Yates between 6:30 and 6:35 at the Baker County High School, dressed appropriately in his role as senior sponsor. He said he left his house. He drove north towards Baker High School, went slightly past the school, maybe a quarter of a mile, to a convenience store, went in and got a soda and certs, came back and came to the high school, whereupon he saw these people. At the times, the other people said they saw him and attended the baccalaureate service. And we had videotape of Jimmy at the baccalaureate service. So I think that's exactly what did happen.
Next, the defense attorneys challenged the theory that the burglary had been staged. They argued Norma had been killed by an intruder who was surprised by her being home.
I think the burglar was looking for the money from the fruit stand. And clearly, anyone who lived in the town would have known that the fruit stand had taken in a lot of money that weekend. And anybody happening up and down the highway who had gone by there would have probably known that too, but more likely someone from town. We were looking at the people probably, we thought it was more than one person, just because of the way the house was laid out and what had been done in the house, and the fact that the struggle that went on in the house. Mrs. Yates was a good shot herself. We felt that someone came in through the back, that she surprised them. We thought that they thought that she had gone with Jimmy to the baccalaureate service, that she was surprised, they were surprised. She threw the flower pot at them and then ran for the gun. And the nearest gun that she could have gotten to was kept in the master bedroom in the dressing table right next to the master bed, with .38 caliber revolver, which was subsequently missing. It's possible that she shot, although we couldn't prove that. The fire destroyed a lot of evidence in the house.
Jimmy Yates did not take the stand in his own defense. But Jimmy's defense was is that the burglar or burglars got into the house, killed Norma, and then set the house on fire.
I believe they did it because you would surely want to try to destroy the evidence and just burn the house down. And I say that's what they did.
After 3 weeks of testimony, Jimmy's fate was now in the hands of the jurors. It only took 4 hours for them to return with a verdict. Jimmy Yates, guilty of first-degree murder.
I got in trouble in the courtroom. I was devastated. They escorted me out and I did holler at Louise, Norma's mother. I said, she's lying, and I know she's lying. And that come across, kind of harsh, because I was just in shock, and I was angry. I was angry, that here's lies that put an innocent man in prison. And I knew I had to go home to my daughter and told her daddy wasn't coming home.
Jimmy was sentenced to life in prison, 25 years without parole. Jimmy's defense team appealed his conviction. After 10 years in prison, Jimmy's case was overturned. The Florida Court of Appeals ruled that an important piece of evidence had been left out at Jimmy's trial. During the investigation, an unidentified fingerprint had been found on an ammunition box in the Yates laundry room. But Jimmy's new lawyers only learned about that mysterious print after his conviction.
The fingerprint belonged to an unknown person and clearly did not belong to Jimmy Yates.
It was stunning news. Jimmy Yates was a free man.
It was exciting. Reunited to my daughter, my baby was there, and I'm telling you, it was as exciting a time as I've ever had in my life.
He was with his daughter, just so happy. I did not believe he would ever be tried again.
But Glenda was wrong. 3 years later, a new prosecution team decided to put Jimmy on trial for a second time.
I didn't believe it ever happened. I had that much doubt, and I had that much, I thought we've got all this information now that it wouldn't happen. And this time was different for me because I didn't go to any of the lawyer meetings, or I wasn't involved in any of it. So it was just, I'd have to go by, well, what's going on? What are they saying? And that was hard for me.
Prosecutors were convinced that Jimmy Yates was guilty, and they believed their evidence was solid.
When you look at the timeline, the crime scene, the fire investigation, when you take that all together, the picture is literally overwhelming that he murdered his wife.
But this time, the defense had a much stronger case. Attorneys argued the mysterious print on the ammunition box was left by an unknown burglar who snuck in through the unlocked back door. Defense attorneys argued that a flower basket strewn across the floor was a sign Norma had struggled with the intruder.
We felt that someone came in through the back. She threw the flower pot at him and then ran.
She retreated to the bedroom. There was a crack just above the door lock in the master bedroom door where somebody had forced it. And then the struggle continued in the master bedroom and the master bath.
They used DNA evidence to strengthen their argument.
There was DNA beneath her fingernails, which was critical, that belonged to a male individual who could not have been Jimmy Yates.
The defense argued Norma Yates must have scratched the burglar during the attack.
The DNA, I think, was the strongest evidence that we had. Clearly, it would be highly unlikely for foreign DNA to get on or under the fingernails of Norma Yates, and to such a quantity that here today, 20 years later, we can find it and have it be the result of contamination, as the state argued. I mean, if it was contamination, you would think you'd be finding it a lot more, and maybe even more than one contaminant. But here you have a very discreet male DNA on the right hand. We knew that Norma was right-handed. There was clearly a horrific fight between her and her assailant, such that it would be likely that DNA would be left. And, in order for the state to argue that it was contamination, they basically have to say that the laboratories that examined this were at fault. And clearly, if they wanted to, they could go back and have those laboratory analysts contribute DNA, which they didn't do, because I think in their heart they knew it wasn't really contaminant, but that was just an argument that they made to try to counter the strength of the DNA evidence.
They even introduced videotape from the graduation service to show Jimmy had been there, acting normal. Jimmy took the stand in his own defense. He insisted he had nothing to do with his wife's murder, and that at the time of the crime, he was at the graduation ceremony. After a 2-week trial, Jimmy's fate was once again in the hands of a jury. After only 4 hours, the foreman polled the jurors to see where they stood.
We only took one vote, and at the time of the vote, it was a unanimous decision.
On March 10th, 2011, Jimmy Yates was found guilty of first-degree murder for a second time.
The main thing was the timeline itself. He was placed at the house at the time that the murder took place, and that the 911 call was placed.
He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. After 2 trials spanning 2 painful decades, Norma's mother feels justice has finally been served. But the shock and pain of losing her only child at Jimmy's hands will never go away.
To think that he did it, that Jimmy did it, it's horrible. She devoted her life to him. I miss her every day. She was just special. The best thing I ever had was Norma. And to have that taken away from you, words can't tell you how. It hurt then, and it still hurts.
In 2008, Glenda and Jimmy divorced. Their daughter is pursuing a career in law enforcement and one day hopes to prove her father is not guilty. Prosecutors, however, are confident Jimmy will spend the rest of his life behind bars. Join us next time when we're back on the case.